Good morning, YouTube. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you for heeding the Twilight's call. Today, we're going to do my very first Commander deck tech using one of my personal favorite decks, Xyris the Writhing Storm. For those who don't know what this is, Xyris the Writhing Storm costs 2 green, blue, red for a 3/5 flying snake Leviathan that says whenever an opponent draws a card, except for their first one they draw each turn, you get to create a 1/1 green snake creature token. Whenever Xyris deals damage to that player, combat damage, you and that player each draw that many cards. So at base value, he's going to hit for 3. You and that opponent are going to draw 3, and you'll create 3 snake tokens. That is in effect of anything else that they may have drawn aside from their own stuff. So any card draw spells that they cast, any kind of trigger spells off of artifacts or enchantments, any of that stuff, you're getting to get more and more snake tokens. And we're going to basically build this deck in a way to abuse those snake tokens. So let's take a look. The first and best way to abuse Xyris' abilities are the wheel cards based off of the original card Wheel of Fortune. We also have Wheel of Fate, Magus of the Wheel, and Reforge the Soul. All of these cards, regardless of cost, have the same wording to them. Each player discards their hand and then draws 7 cards. These effects are basically designed to maximize the card draw that your opponents are doing and then keep on pushing through. So if you Wheel of Fortune, your opponents discard their hand and draw 7 with Xyris on the board. If you're in a 4-player pod, that's 21 snake tokens. Make of that what you will. We also have what I would call pseudo wheels. We have Incendiary Command, Windfall, Memory Jar, and Wheel and Deal. Incendiary Command has each player discards their hand and then draws as many cards as they had in hand, and then the other 2 moves you pick whatever you want. Windfall, each player discards their hands and then draws cards equal to the greatest number discarded this way for all players. Memory Jar, you set aside each player's hand. They draw 7. At the end of the turn, they discard their hand and put the hand back in their hand. And then Wheel and Deal, any number of target opponents discards their hands, draws 7, and then you draw a card. Same effects as the standard wheels for the most part, but you're getting a little bit different effects. They're slightly different, but I like including them in the deck. The last set of pseudo wheels I would talk about are Molten Psyche, Winds of Change, and Whirlpool Warrior. Molten Psyche says each player shuffles their hand into their deck and then draws that many cards, but it also has Metalcraft. If you control 3 or more artifacts, it deals damage for every card they've drawn this turn. So if you've already wheeled before this and then you make them Molten Psyche, they're going to take a bunch of damage off of that. Winds of Change, same thing. All players shuffle their hands into the library and draws that many cards. Just doesn't have a damage effect. And then Whirlpool Warrior is a 2-step thing. When it enters the battlefield, you shuffle your hand into your library and draw that many cards. But then you can pay a red and sacrifice it to make every player do the same thing. Shuffle their hand in, draw that many cards. Just another way to keep the cards churning. Another way to keep the cards churning, we have Howling Mine, Fawn of Mythos, Anvil of Bogarden, and Fairy's Puzzle Box. For those that don't know what these things do, Howling Mine and Fawn of Mythos are artifacts that say at the beginning of each player's draw step, they get to draw an additional card for Howling Mine and 2 additional cards for Fawn of Mythos. Anvil of Bogarden is Howling Mine, but you have a discard effect attached to it, and players do not have maximum hand size. So you can keep filling their hand up, and that will actually make your Windfall and things better later. And then Teferi's Puzzle Box, at the beginning of each player's draw step, they draw their card for turn, and then they take their entire hand, put it on the bottom of their library, and then draw that many cards. So that just keeps cards going, and for every card that they draw like this, more snakes, more triggers, it just snowballs. If we really want to turn the dial up to 11, we have Force Fruition, Folio of Fancies, and Mikokuro, Center of the Sea. Force Fruition is an enchantment that says whenever an opponent plays a spell, they draw 7 cards. That thing can get really dangerous for your opponents. If they do not watch what they're doing and thinking, oh, I'll just draw a bunch of cards and do stuff, they can deck themselves. They have to be careful when playing against this, and it also gives you a ton of snakes and a ton of options. Folio of Fancies, players have no maximum hand size. You can pay double X, tap it, each player draws that many cards, and then it also has 2 and a blue, tap it, each opponent mills the number of cards equal to their hand size. So if they keep filling up their hand with like Force Fruition or whatever else is going on, you could sneak a mill kill out of somebody that got greedy, and then you just make them mill their deck in the middle of a trigger of Force Fruition or some other event. Or maybe you have a way like Mikokuro, Center of the Sea, pay 2, tap it, each player draws a card. You can force them to draw a card off of an empty deck if all of a sudden you mill them out. The last set of cards in this category, I have Induced Amnesia, Nin the Paint Artist, and Nezian Boar. Induced Amnesia, for 2 and a blue, you get an enchantment that exiles target player's hand face down, and then they draw that many cards, and when Induced Amnesia leaves the battlefield, they hit cards back to the owner's hand. Now, you can do this one of two ways. You might have somebody who just tutored for something. Maybe you want to get rid of whatever they tutored for. Nuke their hand, make them draw that many cards. Inversely, maybe your hand is terrible and you need to play catch-up. Exile your own hand, draw that many cards. It's got some flexibility for you. With Nin the Paint Artist, if they have a creature that you need to get rid of, you can blast it and make them draw cards and you'll get more snakes. Nezian Boar, same kind of concept. You force their creatures to block into Nezian Boar, and then each creature that had to block it causes a card draw trigger for the controller. So if you got somebody that you really want to start hitting, or you want to create a snowball effect, swing at that person, make all their creatures block, kill as many as you can, and make them draw a ton of cards. And if you have Xyris on the board, you're going to have a ton of snakes coming. Since I'm so hyped on making snakes, let's actually take advantage of this and really maximize our usage of this ability. We have a Doubling Season, an enchantment that says if an effect would put 1 or more tokens into play under your control, put twice that many into play instead. Same thing for counters on permanents you control. And then Parallel Lives is just basically the first half of Doubling Season. If an effect would put 1 or more tokens onto the battlefield under your control, put twice that many instead. So for every card they draw, if one of these are on the board, you get 2 snakes. Don't see a problem with that. Sticking with the doubling theme, and can also make things very dangerous for your opponents, is Swarm Intelligence and Hive Mind. Swarm Intelligence, for 6 and a blue, you get an enchantment that doubles any instant or sorcery that you cast, and you can choose new targets if it's a targeted spell. So if you're wheeling, you get 2 wheels that go off back to back and double up the effects you get off of Xyris. Even more dangerous is Hive Mind. For 5 and a blue, you get an enchantment that says whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, each other player copies the spell and is able to choose new targets for the copies. So if you cast a wheel effect into a Hive Mind and you're in a 4-player game, all 4 players get a copy of that wheel. So you're actually quadruple casting a wheel effect off of Hive Mind. You have to kind of think of it that way. It's very busted if you get to pull that off, because then it's like, oh, wheel, and you're going to dig them deeper and deeper into their deck, possibly making them lose their win cons to the wheels as they go through. You're making a bunch of snakes, getting a bunch of those triggers that go into the other cards in the deck, which we'll go over here shortly. And all in all, it's just a fun card. Now, since our deck is so focused around the commander itself, Xyris, we need to have ways of either making him better or trying to really amp him up through the roof. So, in that vein, we have Helena and Elena Partners. For 2 red-green, you get a Human Ranger 2/3 with first strike and reach that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1/+1 counters on another creature you control, where X is Helena and Elena's power, and it gains haste until end of turn. So at base, you're at least putting 2 counters onto Xyris every turn, as long as this lives. If it's the first time Xyris has been cast, you can also give it haste, so that amps his power up, which means more cards are going to be drawn off of it, and you're also going to get more snake tokens. We also have Wizard class. For blue, you have no maximum hand size, and if you level it all the way to level 3, whenever you draw a card, you get a counter on target creature. So you can go 1 of 2 ways with this. Every time you wheel, put 7 counters on something. So put 7 counters on Helena and Elena, and then drop 9 counters on Xyris, or just wheel and put all the counters on Xyris. The sky's the limit with that. We also have Blood Mist. For 3 and a red, enchantment at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature gains double strike. Xyris hits twice, you get twice of whatever his power is. Plain and simple. And then we also have Spark Double. For 3 and a blue, you get a 0/0 illusion that copies a target creature that you control, except for it enters with an additional counter on it. It enters, if it was a planeswalker, you also get a extra loyalty counter on it, and it's not legendary. So you can actually have 2 Xyrises on the board, so you'll get 2 separate sets of triggers. So if you have these 2 on the board and you wheel, rather than getting, your 7-card draw, if your other 3 opponents for 21, you'll get 42. It just amplifies the mess, and it's great. Taking advantage of all these snakes that we're getting, We have Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, and Mana Echoes. Ashnod's Altar, you sack a creature, add 2 colorless to your mana pool. Phyrexian Altar, sack a creature, you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And Mana Echoes, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may add an amount of mana equal to the number of creatures you control that share a type with that creature. So you're going to get this colorless mana, and it's exponential. For every snake that comes into play, you're going to get at least 1 mana if it's 1 snake. You'll get 3 mana if it's 2 snakes. You're gonna get, I mean, it's just gonna ramp and amp, and you're gonna get so much mana you're not even gonna have a way to spend all of it. The last category of cards that I have are basically ways you're going to kill your opponents. If you plan on not attacking your opponents to death with all the snakes, you can do Impact Tremors or Perforos, God of the Forge. Impact Tremor says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Perforos does the same thing. It's a 6/5 creature unless you have less than 5 red mana pips on the board. Otherwise, it's just an enchantment that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So that way, if you wheel with one of these on the board, you're going to deal a ton of damage all of a sudden, and your opponents are probably going to be looking daggers at you if they didn't die already. If you need to attack your opponents to death, maybe this came down after you've already wheeled stuff away, then you have Perforos' ability to pay 2 in a red to give all your stuff +1/+0 until end of turn, or play Shared Animosity for 2 in a red. You get an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a creature type with it. So if you have, say, 6 snakes on the board, and don't forget Xyris is a snake, and you swing with all of them, all of a sudden you get +5/+0 to all the snakes that are coming in. So all of a sudden those snakes are 6/1s, and Xyris is going to jump up. If he's just a 3/5, he's going to jump up to an 8/5, and you're going to get 8 more snakes, which is just going to keep snowballing this effect down the line. Great way to kill your opponents if they can be killed by combat damage. If they can't, you burn them to death with the other 2 spells. And you might be wondering, how do we protect our commander? Because I mean, this deck is so centralized around him being on the board. If there's nothing on the board, what am I going to do? Well, there's a lot of ways we can protect him. Some of my favorite ways to protect him and get more value out of it are Possibility Storm and Sunbird Invocation. Possibility Storm says whenever a player casts a spell from their hand, they exile it and then exile cards from the top of the library until they exile a card that shares a type with the card. That player then can cast this card without paying its mana cost, and then all cards exiled with Possibility Storm are shuffled to the bottom of their library in a random order. This is going to draw you some hate, probably, because people do not like having what ability they have to control what they play taken away from them. However, it's really nice to screw with it because then it keeps your stuff alive, and you really don't care, because if you cast one wheel, you're likely going to run into another wheel off of it anyways. So, you know, they wrath your board, well, that's just going to flip them down the board, and then they might hit a card draw spell. Well, didn't kill your stuff. Oh well. Sunbird Invocation doesn't protect, but it adds to the chaos. You're going to, whenever you cast a spell from your hand, you reveal the X top cards of your library where X is the spell's mana value. You can cast the spell X or less from among those cards, and then you shuffle the rest of your bottom of your library in a random order. So, if you wheel, you can basically try to run into another wheel, and you can also just run into other spells. It's kind of a fun card to mess with. To also protect yourself, we have Storm's Wrath, Burn Down the House, and Cyclonic Rift. Storm's Wrath, 2 red, deals 4 damage to each creature in Planeswalker. It's a good way to sweep up the board, and it does not hit Xyris because it only does 4 damage. Burn Down the House, you can make 3 Devil tokens or deal 5 damage to all creatures in Planeswalkers. This will kill Xyris, but sometimes you can get him above that with Helena and Elena or the Wizard class, but sometimes you just need to clear the board and get everything out of the way. This will work. And then the best clearance spell and protection we have in the deck is Cyclonic Rift. Love it or hate it, you know what this card does. You're not ever really going to play it for the 1 in the blue. You're going to play it for the overload cost. 6 in the blue, bounce each non-land permanent you don't control back to its owner's hand. You're going to get that stuff out of your way and go to town. And then the last 2 cards I have for protecting ourselves and our commander. Fierce Guardianship, 2 in a blue instant. If you control your commander, you can play it without paying the mana cost, counter target non-creature spell. You just give a big fat nope to whatever board wipe or exile spell or whatever's trying to come after your commander and your board, just nope it out of here. And then Jin Cataxius Core Augur for 8 blue, 5/4 legendary creature praetor with flash. At the beginning of your end step, draw 7. Each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7. So if you're, wheeling peeling away these cards and you're churning them into more and more and more cards, this is a way to prevent them from using those cards against you. And at the same time, you're going to keep filling your hand back up and trying to get to your best stuff as quickly as possible. And this is what I call the best of the rest of the deck. They don't really fall into the categories of things that I've already talked about, but there are alternate win cons and things that take advantage of the other things that I've shown off in the deck. We have Olmog the Infinite Gyre. For 11 colorless, you get a 10/10. When you cast it, destroy a permanent, and then it's indestructible and has Annihilator 4. Those are all great and dandy, but that's not why this thing's in the deck. This thing's in the deck to keep you from decking yourself, because we are wheeling cards so fast and so furious that you're going to run yourself out of cards probably at least 2 or 3 times. So the idea here is, you flop it to a wheel effect, you shuffle your graveyard back into your library, and this has a twofold effect of protecting your cards in your library from an exile effect and keeping you from running out of cards. In case somebody has somehow managed to keep you from killing them with either burn damage and combat damage, we have our third win con in the deck, Psychic Corrosion. For 2 and a blue. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent mills 2 cards. Straight, simple. And if they're not running an Eldrazi Titan or a Gaia's Blessing, they're going to run out of cards eventually and they're going to die. Since we're doing all this wheeling and making them discard stuff, we also have Geth's Grimoire. This is a little sleeper card that I found in a pile one time in my collection, and I was like, oh, this works out really well in the deck. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you draw a card. So, I'm going to wheel, you're going to discard 7 cards, I'll draw 7 off the wheel, and then I'll draw 7 more off the Grimoire if it's 1v1, and if it's a full pod, you're drawing an extra 21. Have fun with that. And then since we're drawing so many cards, the original version of this deck was a Locust God deck. He's still here. 4/4 for 4 blue red, a god with flying, and whenever you draw a card, create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste. Pay 2 and a blue, draw a card, discard a card, and if it dies, return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. It's like basically having a second commander and a second way to generate tokens, but instead of working off of your opponent's draws, it works off of your draws. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about the mana rocks and stuff. People who play Commander, you know what mana rocks to use. You know your Soul Rings, your Arcane Signets, you know the ramp spells you need to use, Cultivates and Kodama's Reaches. I'm just going to make some suggestions for some lands, and you do not have to use these lands. Some of these lands are really freaking expensive. I get it. There are alternatives, and there's some versions of the alternatives I don't even own, but these are some of the things I would recommend. Shock lands like Breeding Pool here shown. Fetch lands like Wooded Foothills. The original Tri lands like the Frontier Bivouac. Pain lands where you can pay a life to get a color, or you can just tap for a colorless without paying the life. Carplusian Forest. Command Tower, which should be in any multicolor deck you ever play in this format. Sulphur Falls, the check lands, which says if you don't own an island or a mountain, it comes into play tapped, and it taps for a red or blue. And there's color versions for all the other color combinations. Ancient Tomb taps for 2 colorless, deals 2 to you. Some of the spells cost a lot of mana. This just kind of helps ramp you into it. Cinderglade, as long as you have 2 or more basic lands, it comes into play untapped. If it doesn't, you don't, it doesn't. And it taps for a red or a green. Just a good solid dual land without going into the original duels. Exotic Orchard taps for a mana of any color that your opponent's lands do. It's a little less predictable, but you're likely going to hit at least one of your colors off of this. And then Kessig Wolf Run, it taps for a colorless, and then it also taps, pay X red green, target creature gets +X/+0 and trample until end of turn. So you can soup up Xyris and be like, oh hey, we'll just dump all of our mana into him and hit you for a lot and maybe get a commander kill off of him, or just make a boatload of snakes. Just as a disclaimer, I own all the cards I've shown here. I did not pay face value for a lot of these things. I've had them in my collection for a long time. You do not have to use the cards that are in this deck. You can use whatever cards you want if you have access to them. All I gotta say is build the deck the way you want to build it, have fun with it, and enjoy. The card list is in the description below from my Aether Hub. If there's a card that you think I should be using in the deck, please let me know. I'm all ears. If you think I'm using something I shouldn't be using, let me know. I like to hear those comments too. Just go ahead, give me your comments below. Like the video if you like this and you're interested in the deck. Subscribe. I'm planning on doing more Commander content as the future goes on, along with all my MTGA content. And we'll see you next video.